Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to back to our series on the divided kingdom, which we're calling Hope in Israel's Schism. So we're on lesson 4 today, and this is a section that sort of comes in between some of the more detailed stories. So I want to, it can be easy to get lost in the succession of kings. So let's do a little bit of like big picture look here. And then as we start, we'll fit into the structure that we've got into our minds. Okay. So we had the stories of, Saul, David, Solomon, the glory days of the United Kingdom of Israel. And then we saw Rehoboam and how the kingdom split with Jeroboam. And we had our lessons on those, right? And so those were the kings, Rehoboam in the south, Jeroboam in the north, that began the divided kingdom. And what we're going to do is follow the next set of kings until we get to kind of another high point or highlighting point. It's not really a high point. In some ways, it's a low point, but a point where there's many more individual stories in the time of Ahab, the time of Elijah. It will be in the southern kingdom. Less well known is Jehoshaphat in the south, but Ahab in the north, and Elijah prophesying to them. And that's where we'll pick up next week. So this, what we're looking at, is in between, right? The division with Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and then all the way down to the time of Ahab, and in between, what happens, okay? And what we're going to see is the way this section is structured is we're going to get the kings in the south, and then we're going to move over and do all the kings in the north. And so you'll see, like, after we do these kings in the south, we'll have to go back in time a little bit to get those kings in the north, right? Because they're telling it like, when you tell a story, sometimes you skip ahead to follow a thread, right? So that's what they're doing. They'll tell the kings in the south, and then they'll go back and tell the kings in the north. And when we pick up next week, we'll be in the time of Ahab. So questions on that? I want you to take note of the pattern of how things go, both in how the text talks about the kings, like what does it say about every king? What is it, like what judgments are going to be made? And then also pay attention to the pattern of the kings in the north, because that matters. Okay. So before we get into today's text, let's think about last week, right? We talked about Jeroboam and the golden calves. What story from Israel's history did that echo?
Moses and Aaron.
Yeah, specifically in the time when Israel did what? Remember, Aaron said, they gave me the gold and I put it in the furnace, and out popped what? This golden calf. Yeah, specifically when Moses is on Mount Sinai and the people make a golden calf. And we saw, even though that was a bad example, that history repeated itself, as we see so often in the story of Israel. And I think that's part of the point, is we're seeing the people of Israel, Judah and Israel, making the same mistakes over and over. And isn't that the story of humanity, right? We so often make the same mistakes over and over. So where could we see grace in the Jeroboam story that we went through last week? Sharon, were you going to say something?
I said, I don't know.
Well, I'm giving you guys a minute to think, but remember how the story progressed, right? What was that prophecy, that first prophecy to Jeroboam? What did it offer him? What was his opportunity?
To have a line of his own, like had been promised to David.
Yeah, he had a chance to have a house as enduring as that of David's, right? Which God has promised to never completely let die, right? And we see that through the New Testament and how Jesus is the son of David and the new David. And so we see how God is going to bring something beautiful and extended out of the line of David. And we'll see the line of David be very consistent in today's stories. Like, right, we're going to go through the southern kings. Well, they're all the line of David. That's not what happens in the northern kings, but that was the opportunity, right? And then after Jeroboam builds his golden calves, the prophet comes and speaks harshly. And what does he speak against? Does he speak against Jeroboam himself?
The altar. It was the altar.
Yes. Oh, altar, right? This prophecy is against the altar. It's an inanimate object, right? Jeroboam made the choice, but God kind of gives this space for Jeroboam to repent. Remember, it says at the close of that story, even after this is 1333, even after this, Jeroboam did not change his evil ways. Well, that comment tells us Jeroboam was supposed to change his evil ways, right? The prophecy against the altar was his opportunity to repent, right? And then remember when the prophecy against the altar is happening and he stretches out his hand to the prophet and says, seize him, what happens?
Shriveled up.
It shrivels up. And then what does God do?
Fixes it.
He heals him, even though he's still in the midst of his sin. He's completely sinful. The next thing he does is try to bribe the prophet to like give him some better answers, right? But God heals his shriveled hand. And we see that the pattern of God giving these opportunities over and over, opening the way for people to follow him. Now, the people don't follow him. So we are left expecting severe consequences on the house of Jeroboam in the northern kingdom, right? And in the section we're studying this week, we'll do the southern, the way that it's structured, like we've done the northern with Jeroboam. Now we're going to go do the southern, and then we'll come back and we're just waiting for that shoe to drop, right? We know that there are going to be severe consequences. We've had the prophecy against Jeroboam's house as a consequence for his evil. And so we know that will come about. Okay, let's read 1 Kings 14, 21 through 31.
Rehoboam, son of Solomon, was king in Judah. He was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city the Lord had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel in which to put his name. His mother's name was Naamah, and she was an Ammonite. Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. By the sins they committed, they stirred up his jealous anger more than their fathers had done. They also set up for themselves high places, sacred stones, and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. There were even male shrine prostitutes in the land. The people engaged in all the detestable practices of the nation the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem. He carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including all of the gold shields Solomon had made. So King Rehoboam made bronze shields to replace them and assigned these to the commanders of the guard on the duty at the entrance of the royal palace. Whenever the king went to the Lord's temple, the guards bore the shields, and afterwards they returned them to the guard room. As for the other events of Rehoboam's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? There was continual warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and Rehoboam rested with his fathers and was buried with them in the city of David. His mother's name was Naamah, and she was an Ammonite, and Abijah, his son, succeeded him as king.
Thank you. Okay, so we're in the southern kingdom, right? Rehoboam, son of David. And so, it's a son. This is line of David, right? Second grandson of David. Yeah. And how is Judah doing in terms of faithfulness?
Not well.
Not well. What are they doing? What kind of stuff is going wrong in Judah?
Building images, high places,
Yeah.
Asherah poles,
Yes.
and there was even a shrine to the male. Let's see, what is it?
Male
Read that.
prostitute.
Male shrine prostitutes in the land.
Yeah, which we can tell by the wording, like all of this is bad, and then that's the worst, like it's an escalation. So what we can tell, all of these things must be bad things. So let's look at what these are about. So the high places, these are places of worship on hilltops, and they date from the Canaanite ownership of this land. So according to Deuteronomy 12:2, God tells them, when you get this is like the review of the law that Moses does with the people, and this is like instructions for when they get to their inheritance, their promised land, right? You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nation whom you shall dispossess serve their God. So the places where they serve their God, these are the high places, right? On the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. So there's this repetition of languages that they were supposed to come in and destroy all these high places. Well, either they didn't destroy them, or they kind of like took note, and later they rebuild them up again. So this is the practices of the nations around them, where on the top of a hill, you would have a small worship site. These sacred pillars, these are, the Israelites would build a stack of rocks and say, like, this is to remember our God at this point. But these were pillars that were dedicated to these idolatrous gods. They may have been phallic symbols, because a lot of these gods were fertility gods, and they were being worshipped in fertility cults. Asherah in particular is the consort of Baal, right? We hear about Baal a lot. Baal is the most popular god of that area. He's a god of high places, storms, harvest. And Asherah is his consort, right? So these Asherah poles are objects that we don't really know exactly what they were like, but they were wooden objects used in her worship. And then we get to the male shrine prostitutes, and this is where we may do a double take, because like worshiping statues we're seeing, right? But how is it, what is this, what's going on, right? About the worshiping of statues that fits in with male shrine prostitutes, right? So we're going to so hold that thought. And then also, what does the text tell us about Rehoboam's mother?
She was an Ammonite.
Okay, so this is one of those nations. There's a connection between these practices and the Canaanite nations. So I want you to turn over to Leviticus 18, please. So this is a section of the law, the Torah, or the instruction that the Lord gives to Moses to give to the Israelites. And I'm going to read a section and discuss. So verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. Okay, so notice everything, God does this throughout the law. Everything is grounded in the nature and the character of the Lord, right? Who God is supposed to determine who his creation is, who's made the creation made in his image, the people chosen to represent him, right? Mm-hmm. So I am the Lord is the beginning, right? That's the foundation. Verse 3, you must not do as they did in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, right? They haven't gotten there yet, but he's warning them, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Verse 5, keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord. Okay, so this passage, if you'll look, just kind of glance down through all this Leviticus 18, it goes to specify all kinds of sexual relations with close relatives, right? It says no close relatives. And then we get the like play-by-play of all of the sexual relations with close relatives that they're not to have. And it's a long list, and it kind of runs the gamut from something that we would expect, like neighbor's wife is in there, but also every kind of incest, right? Every kind of sex with a grandson, sex with a granddaughter, like it's like, yikes, all the way to sex with an animal. And as you look through all of the incestuous relationships that are prohibited, and given the lifespans, I think we're safe in saying that many of these practices would involve what we would call the molestation of a child, situations which take advantage of the vulnerable. So we need to ask, why does the law need to specify every permutation of incest and sexual sin? Don't we naturally or already know that these things were wrong?
You would think.
You would think. And then, so that's question number one. And question number two is related. Why does the list include, right in line with all the sexual prohibitions, don't give your children to be sacrificed? Okay, that's what we're asking as we read this. And as we get down to the end of the chapter, verse 24, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because, here's our answer to why we need this level of detail. This is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. So what were the Canaanites doing?
Sacrificing the children, the people.
Yes, and how about the long list of incestuous relationships?
Apparently,
All the sexual
is listed. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So this is I read you the beginning of the chapter, the end of the chapter. All the stuff in the middle is the stuff we're talking about, the practices of these nations, right? And he says that they were so it's not that there were deviant individuals who did these things. Every society has some, individuals that do wrong things, right? But that these are the norm. This is the practice of the nations. Verse 26, you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defiled the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations who were before you. Everyone who does any of these detestable things, such persons must be cut off from their own people. Keep my requirements and do not follow any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you came, and do not defile yourselves with them. Then we're back to the foundation. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so we see that these were so bad. These kinds of incestuous and abusive sexual practice and the sacrifice of children were part of the worship of the Canaanite gods, right? I told you when we did our first lesson and we read the beginning of chapter 11, where the text was talking about the story of Solomon worshiping other gods, and it kept saying the detestable God this and the detestable God that. Remember that? And I said, okay, well, this is some really harsh language. Why do we have such harsh language? We're coming around to the reason why we do, in fact, have this language of disgust and against, right? Against the Canaanite gods, because this is the kinds of things that we do that they had done. They had done them so much that they had pervaded their entire culture, right? And God says, I don't want you to be defiled by these practices. And so when scripture says not to worship other gods, we see not only is Yahweh the one true God and that it's false to worship other gods, but that it leads to these corrosive and toxic behavior that the true God would never want for God's people, or indeed for any people, because this is part of the consequence of these groups of nations. He said, I'm going to take care of those nations when it's time, and he did, right? So this is the justice of God coming around, right? And he says, I've done this justice because of the abusive behavior, this corrosive, destructive behavior of these nations. Don't imitate it. But now, what's happening under Rehoboam? These very things, right? Even though the scripture says them very quickly and very matter-of-factly, we have to know that these were very destructive practices that destroy the spirit and the goodness of the people. So we see, as a result, several reversals during this time, right? What's happened to the time of peace that Solomon enjoyed? Look at 14, go back to 1 Kings and look at chapter 14, verses 25 and 26. So remember that Solomon was, David was a man of war, but Solomon had such a time of peace and those extensions of his borders, and everyone, was impressed with him. What happened to the time of peace Solomon enjoyed?
They enter into war and
war with who? We get two examples of the kinds of warfare that's happening.
With Egypt.
Yes.
All the treasures out of the house.
Yeah, Egypt, and they ransack, right? So Solomon, the time of Solomon, there's just processions of people bringing gifts, like to the point that the gifts are ridiculous, right? They're bringing like orangutans and stuff. But here we see that Egypt comes in and ransacks them. It takes the treasure, right? And then they have continual warfare with who? Verse 30.
With Jeroboam.
Yeah, so it's like semi-civil war, war with another kingdom, but it's continual, right? This time of continual warfare. And what happened to the wealth? Remember the golden age of Solomon? What's happened there?
Looks like it came to be brass.
Yeah, my commentary says it's replaced by a rather grubbier bronze age.
This one says a brazen shield.
Yeah, bronze is probably what it was. It's sad to imagine Rehoboam trying to keep up appearances by having these inferior shields made and using them as he goes through the motions of worshiping a God that his heart is not dedicated to, right? So that's the reign of Rehoboam. What does the author tell us in verse 29? You go ahead first, Anne, you go ahead.
Oh, I just had a question before we leave Leviticus. It mentions a couple of times that the land became defiled.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, could you clarify that? Does that mean that the land, like they couldn't grow anything on it? I mean, or is it just to all the people in the land? I mean, is it more that?
I think this is a poetic way of speaking rather than a more literal sort of. I don't think it's saying that the land was barren. Yeah. Because the Israelites go in, they send the spies in during this time and it's flowing with milk and honey, and look at the giant grapes, and so I think we're seeing that they couldn't, their entire cultures are permeated with it to the point that God orders their destruction and removal from the land.
Yeah. Okay.
Other comments on that? Thoughts? It's quite vivid, isn't it? The land vomited them out, and don't you do it or you too will be vomited out, right? And we know, that's what we're headed for. That's the end of the story is exile, right? And that, so we're seeing that very thing going on.
And it also sounds like Sodom and Gomorrah too, how the whole city was defiled.
Yes, destroy it. Yeah. And this is reflecting this idea that sin permeates, right? When the cancer is growing, it begins to take over so that it has its fingers through everything. We really see the power of sin here, right? So often we think of sin as like the list of fun stuff we're not allowed to do, right? But instead, we're seeing that this is an evil that is eating away at the very fabric of their society. So verse 29, what do we get about, what's the wrap up of Rehoboam's reign? This is the beginning of a little pattern here. So somebody read verse 29.
As far as other events of Rehoboam's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annuals of the king of Judah? So, and as reading, this is what is repeated over, it's all recorded in these annuals. Right.
And what's in the annals or the chronicles that's not here, it's the regular king stuff, right? The stuff that you would that they would usually write about, the cities they built and the walls they fortified and the battles they won, all the king stuff that the kings write to write about themselves, go elsewhere for that. This is the prophetic view.
So it sounds like all the bad stuff is recorded in these annuals, and because they were so disgusted by what was happening with these kings that they recorded them so that people might read them and say, don't do this anymore.
Well, I think given kind of the setup that it might be the opposite, that maybe that's what the kings had written down about themselves.
Oh, because they were proud of that.
Here's my presidential library. Here's my kingly version of my reign. Here's what I did in my reign. Here are all my accomplishments. They're in this book. And
those are not good accomplishments that should be recorded.
No, these are not, right? Because this is the prophetic voice, right? So what we're getting, remember, this is the minority report. This is the dissenting opinion, right? You get the king's version of the king's reign in the annals of the kings of Judah, but you get God's view of what was really important in this biblical book, right? So maybe the king, you want to read about the cities that Rehoboam built? Great. Go read his own history where he wrote about the stuff he was proud of. But this is what's important to us, how he behaved according to the Lord. The fact that he brought in these Asherah poles, the fact that he built up the high places, the fact that there were male shrine prostitutes, like this is what matters to the Lord. Yeah. So you're right. That's what I wanted you guys to notice is we're going to get that same repetition. And every time we hear it, it reminds us that there was a view of the king's reign that said, aren't things great? Didn't we do a lot of good stuff? Didn't we build a lot of walls? Didn't we, buy some chariots? Yay. This is not that view. And this is the view that matters, right? So we keep being drawn, not just to the repetition, not just to the pattern, but to the contrast, right? The view of what's important to the kings is not the worldly view, but the godly view. Okay, so we get the story of Rehoboam, and then we see that his son Abijam, or Abijah, your translations may have one or the other, same person, it depends on the manuscript. And look at 1 Kings 15, 1 through 8. Just take a look at that. This is not the name Abijah appears in a bunch of places, like there's a bunch of different Abijahs in this little period, so it can be confusing, but I'm going to say Abijam in the case of Rehoboam's son and the second king, because it makes it a little less confusing. There's still other Abijahs. What is Abijam like?
It says he walked in. It looks like each one tried to outdo the other and how bad they could be.
Right? He's bad and bad, right? Like he's bad and worse. And we don't get a lot of details, except we get one little point, verse 4. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up a son to succeed him and making Jerusalem strong. For David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, so we get this idea that God is, and it even points out here David wasn't perfect, and yet we know that David and his love for the Lord, God is keeping the lamp burning by keeping Jerusalem strong. All right, we move to the next king. We get the same sort of note, like, you want to read the King's version that says his reign was awesome? Go read that other book. This is the book that says what matters, right? Verse 9 through 15. Sharon, would you read 9 through 15? And we're going to hear about Abijam's son, Asa.
Okay. In the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Asa became king of Judah, and he reigned in Jerusalem 41 years. His grandmother's name was Maacah, daughter of Abishalom. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done. He expelled the male shrine prostitutes from the land and got rid of all the idols his fathers had made. He even deposed his grandmother Maacah from her position as queen mother because she had made a repulsive Asherah pole. Asa cut the pole down and burned it in the Kidron Valley. Although he did not remove the high places, Asa's heart was fully committed to the Lord all his life. He brought into the temple of the Lord silver and gold and articles that he and his father had dedicated.
Thank you. Okay, so how's Asa?
He seems like the only good one there.
He's good, right? He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. It says his heart was devoted to the Lord. What specific things did he do to correct the idolatry problems?
Yeah.
He removed the idols.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay, and now which idols were these?
The male, looks like the male idols out of the land.
Well, so those are two different steps, right?
Okay.
Okay, so he removed the idols his fathers made.
And the Asherah poles.
And the Asherah poles.
And
Deposed his grandmother.
Okay, and he deposed his grandmother. Okay, so let's talk about this little list of things, right? He got rid of the idols. Well, but he did, and before, as we go into that list, what one thing did he not do?
He didn't get rid of the high places.
Okay, so it may be that he just took the idols out of the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, because it says he got rid of the idols, but he didn't get rid of the high places. Or it may be that he got rid of the idols on the high places, but left the high places, right? So that over and over, you see the people trying to worship God at the high places when they're not supposed to. They're supposed to go to Jerusalem to worship God in his temple. And I think that distinction is because of this like history of idolatry in the high places and how easily it creeps back in, right? So he gets rid of the idols, he cuts down the Asherah poles, he burns it in the Kidron Valley. That Kidron Valley shows up in the New Testament even, right? This is a valley outside Jerusalem where that is like an ash heap at this, stuff gets burned there, like even garbage. And he expels these prostitutes. So these would have been sexual practices that were part of the worship of these gods, right? Like we talked about in Leviticus. So he gets rid of that, right? He deposes Maacah. Why does he depose her?
Well, she had made that repulsive Asherah pole.
Yes, and we don't know, it says repulsive or horrid. We don't know exactly, was it more repulsive than the other Asherah poles? And if so, why? Why was it horrid? All Asherah poles are horrid, but is this one more horrid? We just don't know, and we wish we did. Does anyone have a different word for Makkah's relationship to Asa?
It says mother.
Yours says mother.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Literally, the word is mother. It is the same as the word, if you look back in 15:2, where it says, it's talking about Abijam, the previous king, right? Asa's father. It says his mother's name was Makkah, daughter of Abishalom. Okay. In verse 10, his mother's name was Makkah, daughter of Abishalom. Exactly the same. Same word, mother. Why would we get grandmother? Why is the NIV, and some translations will not have mother, grandmother, they'll have mother. Why is the NIV telling us grandmother?
So was he a result
Oh,
of
ancestral females were mother, grandmother, mother. They were all mothers.
Okay, I heard both possibilities here. So let's take them in turn. Larry said, well, you can use, just like you can use, he slept with his father David, even though that was his grandfather. Perfectly normal. We knew exactly what that meant. He slept with his father David. We know that David was, in genealogically speaking, his grandfather, and yet that is a way to speak of an ancestor. So it may be that this is a way to speak of a generation removed, a female parent, right? So it may be that Makkah is actually his grandmother. And the text is helping us out to tell us, like, thinking that we won't understand that that's what's going on. And so it translates it grandmother in the NIV. Some of the other translations do not. Or because it does mention that his mother twice, maybe he was, as Sharon said, the product of an incestuous relationship between Makkah and Abijam. And it seems like that would be out of the realm of possibility, unless we've just read Leviticus, in which case maybe not so much out of the realm of possibility. So that may be part of why she needs to be deposed as Queen Mother. This was a royal position. It was prestigious. It involved advising the king and directing the instruction of the palace children. So Queen Mother has quite an influence on the generations coming after, right? And he deposes his mother or his grandmother as Queen Mother because of the Asherah pole, but also maybe there is a problem that would make sense when we understand the way the practices of the nations were integrated into the idolatry. Questions or comments on that?
I wonder too, if something has to be given to culture. Some cultures use the word mother more loosely than we do. I can remember a number of years ago, I attended a choir, I guess you'd call it that. There must have been 30 of them that came from which now I don't remember what country. But anyway, we had an opportunity to, meet them and all this, talk a little bit. And so I was thanking one of the members that I was really glad that they had come to sing. It was beautiful and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And he said, "Thank you, little mother." And from then on, I was little mother, So it was his culture, you just referred to women, I guess, as little mother if you were an older woman. And I was definitely older than he was.
Yeah, and as she is the Queen Mother, which is an official position, but you know, that may have affected how she was referred to. So I don't want to read too much in here, and yet I didn't want to skip that over because I think it's quite possible that as the text is repeating that, it's telling us something about her.
Asa
So, yeah.
is actually David's grandson or great grandson. I lost track.
Great. It goes David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijam, Asa. So we've got a couple of greats in there.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at Asa's reign. So we saw that, let's see, where did we go through? 15, I think. So he was dedicated to the Lord. He brought into the temple the Lord the gold and silver and articles that he and his father had dedicated. So it seems like maybe there was some gold and silver that had been just in use in the palace and not brought into the temple. And so he corrects that situation. Now, verse 16. Read for us 16 through 24, please.
There was war between Baasha and Baasha, king of Israel, throughout their reigns. Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and fortified Ramah to prevent anyone from leaving or entering the territory of Asa, king of Judah. Asa then took all the silver and gold that was left in the treasuries of the Lord's temple and of his own palace. He entrusted it to the officials and sent them to Ben-Hadad, son of Trebimon, and the son of Hazan, the king of Aram, who was ruling in Damascus. Let there be a treaty between you and me, he said, as there was between my father and your father. See, I am sending you a gift of silver and gold. Now break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so he will withdraw from me. Ben-Hadad agreed with King Asa and sent the commanders of his forces against the towns of Israel. He conquered Ijon, Dan, Abel, Beth, Makkah, and all the Kinnereth in addition to Naphtali. When Baasha heard this, he stopped building Ramah and withdrew to Tirzah. Then King Asa issued an order to all Judah. No one was exempt, and they carried away from Ramah the stones and timber Baasha had been using there. With them, King Asa built up Geba in Benjamin and also Mizpah. As for all other events of Asa's reign, all his achievements, all he did, and the cities he built, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? In his old age, however, his feet became diseased. Then Asa rested with his fathers and was buried with them in the city of his father David. And Jehoshaphat, his son, succeeded him as king.
Thank you. Okay, so a couple of things to note here, right? First of all, we're referring to the Baasha, king of Israel, and we haven't met Baasha, king of Israel, right? That's because we're going to have to, we've done the sequence in the southern kingdom of Judah, and we're going to have to go back and do the sequence in the northern kingdom of Israel, right? And so we're in the middle of that, is Baasha is in there. And so, that's why we're getting this character that we haven't met yet. We're also seeing that there's a geographical component to everything that's going on, right? Baasha decides, hey, let's build up a fortified city in a place where I can block the road. The major road that comes into Jerusalem, into Judah, and therefore and continues into Jerusalem, he is going to block, and that's part of their warfare. And so he's building up the city so that he can control that. And we know that route was in a valley, and so blocking that, it's like it creates that pinch point, right, where he's in control of everything. And so Asa says, I can't manage with that blocked, and their little political thing ensues. what does Asa do to get out of that problem?
He tries to make a treaty with Baasha.
Well, so I don't know, you know, maybe he did try to use diplomatic means with Baasha to start with, but I think they were beyond that at this point. And so who does he go and make a treaty with instead?
Ben Hadad.
King of?
Yeah, this is Israel.
Abraman.
So this is the king of Aram, right? This is like, if you're picturing your map of Israel, you know, Israel's kind of a long, skinny country on the edge of the Mediterranean. And this, the Zoom thing sometimes mirrors, so you may have to imagine this mirrored. I'm not sure how it's going to come through to you, but if this is the Mediterranean, here's Israel, Aram is up here. It's where Damascus is. So it's a threat throughout these years, right? We see Aram comes up as a threat to the people repeatedly. And so with a gift, what would we normally call the gift that he sends to Ben-Hadad, king of Aram?
Bribe.
A bribe, right? He uses a bribe to convince Aram to turn on, to betray his alliance with Israel and make an alliance with Judah. And thereby he reverses the process, right? He gets access to Ramah. He takes away the building materials that they were using to fortify that city. He builds up his own protective, you know, fortified city that it strategically for him, right? Questions or comments on what happens in this section? Do we get the return to the peace and prosperity that we had in the time of Solomon?
I think so.
You know, the generational effects of sin are showing up, aren't they? The sin of Rehoboam, refusing to be the servant of the people as the king should be, has caused this, you know, estranged part of the kingdom to have this ongoing war with Israel. And the war through the treaty with Aram results in the loss of Israelite territory. So even though it's kind of like Asa was successful in this gambit he runs with Ben-Hadad, all this territory that should belong to the whole nation of Israel is then taken over by Ben-Hadad. So it's a loss for the people of God as a whole, right? Asa has to bribe Aram to get help. And what does he ransack in order to bribe Aram, or Ben-Hadad of Aram?
The temple, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. Solomon had the power position in all of his treaties, but Asa does not have the power position. He is having to bribe, and he ransacks the temple to do it. And I think we're seeing that the idolatry and the sins of Abijam, of Makkah, of Rehoboam, the effects that they had on the faithfulness to the nation. And we're reminded of God's pronouncement to Solomon at the end of his life that not only would God divide the kingdom, but this is in 11:29, he would humble David's descendants. So we see that this pattern is continuing, where the evils of idolatry are affecting the people. We have some notes about Asa at the end of his life. I want to come back to that as we finish the lesson. So let's do, I knew this was a long section. We're going to have to do a brief run through of the kings of Israel, right? This finishes the section in the south, and now we're going to go back in time and do the section in the north, right? So if we go back in time, we come back to the point of Jeroboam. So 1528, we have Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, who becomes king in Israel in the second year of Asa. So Jeroboam lasts a long time, right? He has a long reign because we're already into Asa's reign, and it went Rehoboam, Abijam, and then Asa, right? So but it says he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, walking in the ways of his father and his sin, which he had caused Israel to commit. So Nadab is bad. He does evil, and more than that, he causes Israel to do evil. And what happens next in 1527?
He plotted against.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a coup, right? Baasha who's the son of Ahijah, no relation, right? This is a different one, but we see Baasha is of the tribe of Issachar, and that's probably why Issachar is mentioned to tell us like no relation to the previous Ahijahs, right? Baasha stages this coup and destroys Jeroboam's whole family. What's the significance of the destruction of the whole family of Jeroboam?
Succession to the throne is gone.
Right. He does it to secure his position, right? What's the spiritual significance? Verse 29.
That ends the line that God had promised him if he had stayed faithful.
Yes. And what did God prophesy since when he didn't stay faithful, that his whole line would be ended, right? This was the fulfillment of the prophecy of Abijah the Shilonite that we read in chapter 14, right? When the wife disguises herself for the blind man, remember this, that little silly thing? Ahijah the Shilonite at that point prophesies the destruction of every member of Jeroboam's family, and Baasha carries that out. Now, is Baasha doing it because he's following the word of the Lord, like he's really devout?
Probably not.
It doesn't say that God ever told him to, and it doesn't seem like he has much in mind of the things of God. So let's look at the next section. It says, as for the other events of Baasha's reign, his achievements, aren't they written in the king's book that loves to tell about their own achievements, right? This is 16 through 5. Now, what happens is that we get another prophet arising. This is Jehu, the son of Hanani. We learn Hanani was a prophet to, I think, Asa. In Chronicles, we learn that. But this is not the Jehu that we're going to read about extensively later in the book. Like, he's a memorable guy because he drives like a madman. Not that Jehu. This is the prophet Jehu. So Jehu's message to Baasha, right? He says, I lifted you up, right? Now your house is going down just like the house you destroyed. 16:1 or 16:2. I lifted you up from the dust and made you leader of my people Israel. I imagine Baasha thought he lifted himself up. But God says, in fact, I lifted you up. He says, but you walked in the ways of Jeroboam and caused my people Israel to sin and provoked me to anger by their sin. So I am about to consume Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like that of Jeroboam of Nebat. So he says, the house you destroyed, same pronouncement for you. And then if you move down to the end of that little section, verse 7, we see the reasons that Baasha is going to be destroyed is because of the sin he committed, becoming like Jeroboam, the house of Jeroboam, and also because he destroyed the house of Jeroboam, right? So even though it worked as a fulfillment of God's prophecy, it was the work of Baasha to do this kind of this murderous thing where he kills the whole household, and the bill will come due for that behavior as well, right?
Reminds me of the saying, you get what you give.
Yeah, and I think, Baasha probably did this not out of devotion to the Lord, because we see he's not devoted to the Lord, but instead his own self-interest. So we're going to get a pattern, right? We see Jeroboam reigns a long time, and then Nadab gets a little short reign, and then Baasha stages a coup. Well, look what happens with Baasha. Baasha gets a decent length of reign, but then 24 years, it says, but then his son, Elah, succeeds him on the throne, and then short reign, there's another coup. Look in verse 16:9. Zimri, one of his officials, who had command of half his chariots, this would be a high official, right? He plotted against him. He waits till Elah's drunk, and then he struck him down, killed him and succeeded him as king. Well, Zimri only lasts 7 days, so he doesn't really count. But Omri comes, and the people of Israel make Omri king. So we have a little pattern here where God raises someone up, long reign. Their son takes over, short reign, knocked out, there's a coup. Next one, same pattern. So do we see that, like we see Jeroboam, Nadab is parallel to Baasha, Elah. And we have to, it's a loose parallel because we have to like not count Zimri, and then we have Omri. So we're going to keep that pattern in mind next week as we talk about Ahab, because that pattern would normally dictate that Ahab has the short reign and is knocked out, and God does something completely different in the reign of Ahab. So hold that in your mind for next time. Omri does not kill everybody to be made king. And so we might, if we hadn't read this before, we might go like, oh, look, here's a chance for reset. He doesn't come to power by murdering an entire family. Maybe he will reign well and walk in the ways of the Lord. And yet, verse 21, not 21, verse 25, 16:25, but Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord and sinned more than all those who sinned before him. He walked in the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, even though he's 2 coups removed from the house of Jeroboam, right? 2.5, 3 coups removed. In his sin, which he caused Israel to commit, so that he provoked the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger by their worthless, empty idols. And then we got the close on Omri's reign. So that takes us to the time of Ahab. We've had these 3 kings in Judah, and then we've had the succession of coups in Israel that it's just gone from bad to worse, right? Questions or comments on the progression there?
It sound like us, couldn't it?
Sometimes, right?
Power corrupts.
It
Absolute
surely
power
does. It
corrupts.
surely
Absolute.
does.
Yeah, we see the power of corruption in the side of Israel, right? Definitely. And I think we see that they have persisted in having these places of worship that are not related to the place of worship of the one true God, the Lord of the whole people of Israel, right? And so they are not connected to God, and that disconnect leads to just ever increasing evil, right? It's only God that pulls us into goodness, right? God is the one who draws us into truth and holiness, and without that connection, where are they? Right? They're in ever increasing evil land. Now, Asa in Judah is like this bright spot, right? And Jehoshaphat after him is also going to get a good report. So we have sort of this up and down in Judah that we see. But even on the side of Asa, we see the disconnect, right? Because the things that happen in Asa's reign don't indicate that Asa really understood the trust that he could have in God, right? If we turn back over to chapter 15, the section between Asa 15:18 to 15:24. So we see that Asa, yes, he was devoted to the Lord, I think meaning that he didn't worship idols. But he wasn't trusting of the Lord, right? Doesn't the Lord fight your battles for you? Isn't that what the people of Israel had learned over and over again? And yet I don't think Asa knew, and maybe he hadn't been taught how much he could trust the Lord, how much God would do for him if he would turn it over to the Lord. He's doing the bribe, he's taking the building materials from Ramah and building up his own. It indicate the way that this is written. I think it's a little bit obscured in the NIV, but the way that it's written is more like he used forced labor again. You'll notice no one was exempt. Verse 22, King Asa issued an order to all Judah, no one was exempt, and they carried away from Ramah the stones and timber Baasha had been using there. This is forced labor again. So he's back to the practices that are the only practices he knows. The trust is not there. As I was reading this section this week, I'll tell you that a song that we sang on this past Sunday, I think it was, is what kept echoing in my mind. So turn over to Psalm 20. This is a Psalm of David. You know, David had his problems, even points out, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite, right? Like David had his sins in his life. But the extraordinary thing about David was his heart devotion to the Lord. So let's end in Psalm 20. May the Lord answer you when you are in distress. May the name of God of Jacob protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and grant you support from Zion. May he remember all your sacrifices and accept your burnt offerings. There's a sense of like, lean on God. He has your support structure. You don't need to build it yourself. You don't need to demand other people come build it. Verse 4, may he give you the desire of your heart and make your plan succeed. We will shout for joy when you are victorious and will lift up our banners to the name of the Lord our God. May the Lord grant all your requests. Know that the Lord saves his anointed. He answers him from his holy heaven and with the saving power of his right hand. Some trust in chariots and some trust in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. They are brought to their knees and fall, but we rise up and stand firm. O Lord, save the King, answer us when we call. So I think we're seeing this idea of like, where is the trust that we have? Do we place it in chariots, horses? What are our equivalents, right? Jobs, wealth, prestige, wisdom, even wisdom. Solomon must have put a lot of trust in his wisdom, even though it was from God. It wasn't really where his trust belongs. Some trust in chariots, but we trust in the name of the Lord. Thank you all for your discussion today. I'm going to end since we went a little bit over. I would rather hear more comments. If you want to do that, go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Deanna.
Yes.
Joyce has our prayer today. Are there any new prayer concerns?